Welcome to everyone on this third Resource Extraction and Climate Issues webinar, sponsored by the Joining Hands Partnership Program, an initiative of the Hunger Program of the Presbyterian Church, USA. The purpose of the Joining Hands Partnerships is to bring together global and U.S. networks to work to address root causes of hunger and poverty. The purpose of the Resource Extraction and Climate Issues table and these calls is first to bring together people who are concerned about the impacts of the resource extraction industry, which includes minerals, gas, oil, coal, and other resources, locally, nationally, and globally. Second, to learn more about these issues. And third, to join together in responsible actions. My name is Ellie Stock. I have worked with the Joining Hands Peru Partnership since 2001. I'm the convener for the Resource Extraction and Climate Issues table and will be the moderator for this webinar. Mining provides most of the raw materials that go into the products that we enjoy and that sustain our way of living. Unfortunately, these valuable resources are extracted at the expense of citizens, communities, and nations where they are extracted, often resulting in hunger, poverty, environmental destruction, undermining economic, political, and cultural structures, creating violence and instability. Today, in this webinar, we focus on shell companies and transparency in the resource extraction industry. Shell companies are anonymous offshore or domestic companies that are used by corporations, governments, crime, terrorist groups, and other entities to avoid transparency and often payment of taxes. Information about such companies was revealed in the recently leaked Panama Papers, the largest volume ever of leaked papers. Our first presenter this afternoon on this issue will be Mark Hayes, Senior Advisor for Global Witness, a nonprofit campaigning organization that seeks to expose and break the links between natural resource exploitation, corruption, and conflict. Mark works specifically on Global Witness's campaign advocating for beneficial ownership transparency in the U.S. and around the world. For nearly 15 years, Mark has conducted advocacy, research, and campaign development for a wide range of environmental and social change organizations, including Oxfam America, the Sierra Club, Public Citizen, Greenpeace, NAACP, and others. His work has helped these organizations develop bold and strategic campaign strategies to engage a wide variety of stakeholders, including business, in transformative environmental and social change efforts. Our second presenter will be Jeff Bamenjo, coordinator of the Joining Hands Cameroon Partnership, RELUFA, who will talk about a case study where extractive companies try to avoid financial transparency and taxes, or how tax havens and shell companies are used to hide ill-gotten wealth from a country like Cameroon. Jaff has a master's degree in development studies from the Institute of Social Studies in The Hague, Netherlands, specializing in the politics of alternative development. He has been working with RELUFA since 2009. And our third presenter will be Karen Wilson, coordinator of the Joining Hands Peru Partnership Economic Justice Campaign, who will share a few words about partners in the U.S. working on the transparency issue through the Publish What You Pay campaign. So welcome and thank you all for being presenters here today. So now I invite Mark from Global Witness to help us better understand the nature and workings of shell companies.
Well, thank you very much to all of you. I am really pleased to be joining the Presbyterian Church and the Joining Hands Working Group to talk about this pretty critical issue. I'm going to take just a moment to get my presentation queued up, and then I'll jump right in. All right, great. So you should be able to see that at this point. Once again, thank you all for taking time to join us for this presentation. I'm really honored to be joining the other distinguished speakers. And my hope today is just to give you a quick introduction to the role of shell companies in facilitating corruption, crime, and conflict around the world. It's a huge issue, more that we can cover in just today's conversation, but I hope to give you an introduction, a little bit about why it's relevant to pursuing justice and accountability in the extractive sector, and what are some things that people can do to help promote transparency measures that can solve some of the problems inherent in the secrecy embedded in this process. So just a bit about me and Global Witness for those of you who aren't familiar with our organization. Global Witness is an international advocacy organization that seeks to expose and break the link between natural resources, corruption, and conflict. And we do this because we believe that people living in resource-rich countries should benefit from those resources and their sustainable management, but instead all too often those resources are captured by a corrupt elite either in the public sector or the private sector, and, as it's pertinent to this conversation, stashed in bank accounts in the West. I believe Jeff's going to talk about a case like that in detail. We are best known for many of us our work on the issue of so-called blood diamonds, where we were one of the first organizations to expose how the illicit diamond trade was fueling conflict in places like Sierra Leone and Angola, and that specifically people were using the diamond trade to finance their military operations with the willing and knowing participation of the industry itself, as well as the financiers who back them. And I think the reason that we talk about shell companies and why we're in this today is, simply put, what we've learned in our nearly 20 years of investigations into corruption, natural resources, and state looting is that one of the easiest ways to move money, if you want to do it quietly without being detected, is to set up a company and disguise the fact that you own it. So when we talk about an anonymous shell company, we're essentially talking about something that can be used to open a bank account or buy a yacht. It can transact business like any other company. And since you don't have to report the fact that you own that company, that means that these shell companies are a favorite tool to carry out corrupt natural resource deals. But they also hide all sorts of other unsavory behaviors around the world, from terrorism to human trafficking to tax dodging and everything in between. And that's both true internationally as well as domestically. And to add insult to injury, not only does this anonymity provide a shield for corrupt and criminal actors to get away with their activities undetected, it also stymies the efforts of authorities, law enforcement, civil society, journalists, and others to track down who's behind these deals and hold them accountable, simply because there's no paper trail to follow, and if you find something, the trail goes cold. So I'm going to talk a bit about how that works, but first I should say one thing about the Panama Papers, about the significance of it. For those who haven't followed that story, essentially the Panama Papers is, as was described earlier, a massive data leak of emails, correspondence, company documents, and a range of other materials leaked from a law firm based in Panama, an infamous one called Mossack Fonseca, who many had known for many years was involved in working with clientele of various unsavory stripes, and had been in trouble with law enforcement before, but nothing quite like this. The leak is massive, 2.6 terabytes of data, millions of documents, the biggest ever of its kind. And the information was released by a consortium of journalists called the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, who received the information via one of their partners, Süddeutsche Zeitung in Germany, who was tipped off by an unknown leaker who said they had data that they might be interested in. And they are an organization that's been experienced in facilitating these kinds of massive collaborations with media organizations across multiple jurisdictions, which is in itself a feat. And what the papers show is essentially a massive network of shell companies used to facilitate all of the crimes and questionable activities I've described, from tax dodging to sanctions evasion to drug trafficking and more and more. And what's really new about this is the scale of the activity and the scale of the data and how many different people are implicated. But what's not, unfortunately, this has been an issue that we and many others working in these fields have known about for many years. So the Panama Papers provides a tremendous opportunity to really shine a light on this subject and drive action both here in the U.S. and around the world. So I'm going to use one case to really provide an example of the kinds of impacts that these shell companies can have, and then talk a bit about how shell companies work. Many of you might be familiar with this case. We come up against anonymous companies in many of our investigations, such as one focused on Equatorial Guinea, which, as many know, is a small oil-rich country in West Africa with a deplorable human rights record, where most of the people there live on less than $1 a day. And this man is the son of the president for life of Equatorial Guinea. And by all accounts, he has spent more than $300 million over the course of the last 2 decades to support a playboy lifestyle, globetrotting around the world. And he used anonymous companies to spend some of his corruptly acquired loot. For example, you know, we know that there were at least $110 million of suspect funds pulled from Equatorial Guinea between 2004 and 2008. And we know through our own investigations and working with law enforcement that Mr. Obiang used $30 million of that money to buy this Malibu mansion using an anonymous California shell company. He also purchased a $38 million private jet with an anonymous company from the Virgin Islands. And, you know, if people are interested, he also used some of that money to buy nearly $2 million of Michael Jackson memorabilia. So how did Obiang manage to get the money in the U.S.? Well, lawyers and shell companies were the key. Obiang had 2 California lawyers, and they helped him to incorporate these shell companies that did not have his name associated with them, and then use those shell companies to acquire American bank accounts. And used the companies, not his own name, to purchase these assets. His name was never on the books. Now, as investigations began to go after Mr. Obiang, the banks themselves realized that they might be complicit in this activity. They attempted to close the accounts. But because the system allows people to set up shell companies so easily, Mr. Obiang was able to simply move his assets from one company to one account, and so on and so forth. Finally, in October 2014, after a long-running investigation, the U.S. Department of Justice came to a settlement with Mr. Obiang where he agreed to plead no contest and relinquish some of the money that he stole from Equatorial Guinea. And I should note the way he did this is he positioned himself as a Minister of Timber and other natural resources and set up shell companies to siphon off money from these corrupt natural resource deals. However, this was a case over 14 years in the making. Only a fraction of the money that was stolen from Equatorial Guinea's people has been recovered. And what's really important for people to understand that this is just one of dozens of cases out there. So another case we know about is the case of Shell in Nigeria that paid $1.1 billion to access a massive oil block there. They paid the money to a shell company that was supposed to be a domestic partner in the project, but it actually was a secret company owned in secret by the former oil minister Dan Atet. The only reason we know anything about who owns it is because one of the middlemen in the deal sued another in Italian court, prompting a legal inquiry. And that's the tip of the iceberg. One whistleblower we work with on that case has told us the Nigerian Central Bank says they can account for roughly $50 billion of oil revenues during a short period of time in the last decade or so, and suspect that much of that money may have been siphoned off in a similar manner. So for faith communities concerned about calling out corruption in these natural resource-rich sectors and communities, the corruption facilitated by these schemes hinders development, hinders anti-poverty efforts, hinders efforts to empower local communities. Finding out who actually owns these companies is critical part of promoting transparency in this sector. You'll hear more from folks and know more about the work that many organizations have done under the publish what you pay rubric, getting people to actually be transparent about the money paid during these natural resource deals as a critical step for transparency. But in order to do that, you also need to publish who's being paid, publish who you are. So that's why we're so focused on this issue. But I should say that while we focused on natural resources, you know, this is an issue across many different sectors. In fact, we often say that shell companies, anonymously owned, are the one thing that unites virtually all crimes that generate money. So what exactly is a shell company? It's a legal entity on paper that exists like any other company, but it has no significant assets, no true physical presence, conducts no real business. It's the same legally as any other company, but its use is far different. It's used as a vehicle to move money. And the best way to understand how this works is to think about it from a law enforcement perspective. Law enforcement often talks about how when they are tracking the money laundering activities of a criminal network, they look at a system that relies on 3 steps. You have placement, layering, and integration. So you have a dirty money source and you need to get it into the financial system. So you need to place it into the account of a particular bank to get it cleaned. Next, you do layering, where you create a series of fictitious transactions that attempt to present the money involved as coming from a legitimate source involving legitimate players. You want many layers to prevent you and the people who made the money from being tied to these transactions. So you set up shell companies to essentially represent your interests and your transactions without actually having your name on it. And then once you've created a layered effect, you integrate it. You move it into, say, the purchase of an asset like a piece of real estate, and where it can appreciate, again, not tied to you, and can be used to either live a luxury lifestyle or invest. Anonymous companies can be used in every part of that kind of scheme. And the key reason why we have anonymous companies is actually fascinating. The reality is that in most cases, no jurisdiction requires you to disclose the fact that you own a company when you first form it. In fact, in many U.S. states, it's harder to get a library card without disclosing some kind of information about who you are than it is to set up an anonymous shell company. So a few examples just to give you the scope of how this works. The Los Zetas Mexican drug cartel used Oklahoma anonymous companies to buy racehorses in the U.S. with millions of dollars of drug money. Former congressman from Louisiana, William Jefferson, known for taking money from clients overseas or individuals overseas against congressional rules. Also less well known that the money he acquired from that corrupt deal, in addition to being stashed in the freezer, was moved through anonymous shell companies. One of the largest Medicare fraud cases in history, through an Armenian gang, set up 118 fake health clinics in the U.S. using anonymous companies. And then at a much lower level, there have been contract fraud at the education level, where an Ohio IT manager for an Ohio school district set up fake companies in the name of his relatives and bilked his school district for $34 million before he was caught. There's also contract fraud and medical fraud. A major fraud case in the Ukraine, basically people use shell companies working through Oregon to jack up the prices of vital vaccines, forcing the Ukrainian government to pay more money than they actually needed to. And then lastly, there's a case where a U.S. government contractor pretended the companies he owned were owned by ethnic minorities to get access to lucrative contracts and supplied the U.S. government and U.S. military with shoddy military parts for trucks bound for places like Iraq and Afghanistan. So most people think that shell companies are a problem overseas, like the Caymans, but actually the U.S. is one of the most popular places to set up shell companies. A World Bank study found that the U.S. was the favorite destination for shell companies set up by the corrupt to move their money, and another study found that the U.S. was one of the easiest places to do this. And the reason is that, like I said, no jurisdiction, but more specifically, you can set up a company in any state in the U.S., in all states, and no company currently requires to disclose a very specific piece of information, the ownership. I'm having trouble advancing my slide, so I'll keep going. We'll see what happens. So as I said before, creating a U.S. shell company sometimes takes less information than acquiring a driver's license or a library card. All you have to disclose is essentially the name of your company, an agent, a contact address that doesn't have to be your address, you're in business. One great example that came from the Panama Papers, an entity called Fusion published an online video where one of their reporters went to a Delaware service provider, a company that sets up companies, and set up a shell company in the name of her cat. And it took 2 minutes. So that's a huge gaping hole in our efforts to combat corruption, crime, and a range of other social ills. So our organization, well, first I'll show you a couple of resources that we use to capture this. This is a map we have online that captures examples of all kinds of cases where shell companies have been used to hurt people both in the US and around the world, and broken it down by category, both by the people affected and where the companies were created. We also have, that's the map, and then we have a great animated short that tells people a little bit more about how these anonymous companies work. And then we of course did a major undercover investigation showing the role that lawyers play in the US in setting up these kinds of anonymous shell companies with very little oversight that was profiled by 60 Minutes. I'm running out of time here, but I really do want to focus quickly on what we can do about this. It doesn't have to be this way. We can actually change the law to make company ownership more transparent. For a number of years now, bipartisan legislation in Congress has been introduced that would require the states or the federal government to do a simple thing, to simply collect information about the owners of companies when companies are first formed, and to keep that information up to date. There's a bill in the Senate and the House right now. It's a long name, I'll send it, but it's the Incorporation Transparency and Law Enforcement Assistance Act, which would require the states or the federal government to do this, and you simply put your name on a line, you provide a piece of ID like a driver's license or an ID card, and a real address where you can be contacted. And for the vast majority of people running businesses, most of them know who their beneficial owners are. It's mom, dad, and grandpa. This will not be a problem to meet. But the challenge is we need to change the status quo, because it's been very difficult to get this passed, because unfortunately some wealthy interests who benefit from some of the secrecy provided by this are opposing the work. So I think the last thing I'll say, and I think I can speak more to this at Q&A, is simply this is an obscure problem, but it connects so many different issues. It's a global problem, but there are considerable local solutions. And I'd encourage folks here, as a point of action, I'll be sending out information after the call with your colleagues on ways they can contact their member of Congress, either as an individual, a congregation, or as an organization, to encourage them to support this piece of legislation. So that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark, not only for the information, but for very practical ways that we can be engaged in addressing this issue. There will be some time, as you mentioned, for questions afterwards at the end of all the presentations. But this time we welcome our second presenter, Jaf Amenjo from Joining Hands Cameroon Partnership, ROLUFA, who will be joining us from the Cameroon, and will talk about shell companies and the lack of transparency in the Cameroon.
Continue since I was just saying that Mark has probably set the stage for this discussion about shell companies or anonymous companies. What I'm going to do is just to focus on the case study about Cameroon. Please, can you forward the slide? Eileen?
I forwarded the slide, Jeff. Okay.
Maybe for those who do not know Cameroon, let me just very quickly give the background of Cameroon. It is located in the Gulf of Guinea, and this is a country with an abundance of mineral resources. If you talk about the Gulf of Guinea, you remember countries like Nigeria, Equatorial Guinea, that Mark talked about. They are near Cameroon. Cameroon shares boundaries with all these countries, and it's very, very, very much in the natural resources. But however, can you forward please to background? However, despite these riches, the country is characterized by endemic poverty. This is actually due to governmental or institutional irresponsibilities. Now, I think if we look at the map, the following map, go to the next map, please. Anyway, I was just saying that Cameroon is endowed with lots of natural resources, and there are so many problems. The first problem is a growing portfolio of failed mining projects in Cameroon, because for now there is actually no functioning industrial exploitation. However, most of the mining is just artisanal at the moment. Since we are talking about these anonymous or shell companies, I have a couple of them, but I've just chosen one example just to indicate and align with what Mark was saying earlier. We have companies like Geovic, C&K, Sundance Resources. These are companies that got exploitation permits to start industrial mining, but till now they have not started because it is ridden with problems. And one problem is few well-connected individuals have made millions from all these projects. And that is what is happening in Cameroon. Because sometimes through the tax havens around the world, it is very common. And the common agent is Mossack Fonseca law firm in Panama, as Mark said. I deliberately mentioned this law firm because this is actually a contemporary issue. And just for your information, with respect to Cameroon, 58 Cameroonian enterprises and persons so far are cited in the Panama Papers. 58. But this is not all. And to go back straight to the Geovic mining, the case study that we have for today, I just want to align with Mark to indicate how this problem functions with respect to Cameroon specifically. And I deliberately choose the example of Geovic Mining Corporation because this is an American company. But to actually indicate the connection with anonymous mining company, I just need to tell the small story about the Geovic. Geovic basically is a Denver-based company that was created in 1994 in Delaware. I'm happy that Mark, in his presentation, also made mention of this of Delaware. This company obtained a mining permit in 2003 to exploit cobalt, nickel, and manganese. Study was ever done before the permit was given. And one particularity of this project is that it has never exploited any mineral anywhere in the world. And even till now, 2016, despite the fact that it got the permit in 2003, there is no functioning exploitation in Cameroon per se. And now, according to the project, Geovic had 60.5% interest in the project, and the state agency, which is called the National Investment Corporation, had 39.5% of the stake, including unidentified local shareholders. And this is where it becomes very interesting. Unidentified local shareholders. Till 2008, the names of these unidentified local shareholders was never communicated. But there were rumors about political connections. However, in 2013, according to an EITI report, EITI is the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative that we are talking about. According to an EITI report for Cameroon, there is a requirement to disclose the owners or the shareholders of companies. Paradoxically, the names of these people were released, these unidentified local shareholders. And curiously, the four of them were politicians, strong politicians. And some were even nieces of politicians or even the wives of politicians. You can see the connection between the political elites and the economic agents. And what makes the story very interesting is that the government of Cameroon in 2008 won approval to use $60 million of IMF-administered public funds to invest in the Geovic project. Now, let me explain a bit. At that time, Cameroon was under the Structural Adjustment Program. So the public funds, owned by Cameroon were under the IMF, and therefore it could not use the money without the approval of the IMF. And it is paradoxical that the funds that were used to finance this company were taken from oil or petrol sales. Normally, this money is meant for poverty alleviation, but in this case it is used, to support a project which is not ongoing. And at the moment, as a coincidence, there was a whistleblower working at the IMF, International Monetary Fund, the name Eugene Nyambal, and paradoxically, he's also a Cameroonian. In 2009, he complained that the IMF agreement was a gamble to embezzle millions of dollars in public funds. That was the complaint he gave. And this is now the connection with what we were talking about, anonymous companies. In 2006 precisely, Geovic Mining Corporation transferred the headquarters of one of its subsidiaries, which was called Geovic Limited, to the Cayman Islands, which is a tax haven. And according to Eugene Nyambal that I was talking about, the whistleblower, the bulk of the IMF approved financing was transferred offshore to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Therefore, the money was not entirely used to invest in the project, but it went to offshore accounts. And we can now see the connection. And because this man was really complaining, blowing the whistle, he was dismissed from his post at the IMF, because at the time he was a worker at the IMF. And as a civil society organization, RELUFA and our partner organization, the Center for Environment and Development, in 2013, wrote to the then managing director, the current managing director of the IMF, for clarifications on this issue. What I have to mention too is that this deal was done when Dominique Strauss-Kahn was still the director of the IMF. But we wrote a letter when he was already replaced, a different person. But till now, we've never had any satisfactory answer or even acknowledgement of receipt of the complaint that we forwarded to them. So, and my issue here is not necessarily maybe tax avoidance in this case, but the fact that public officials, like the ones that I've just cited, plunder public resources through shady deals. Like this project now, we can consider it is a shady deal because the company is not moving, there is no exploitation, and it has even been delisted from the Toronto Stock Exchange. Now, what observations can I make after all this? It is very clear that the political and economic elites have links with extraction companies, like the one that I've just cited in Cameroon. Therefore, they use their influence to maintain the status quo. Despite the fact that we are complaining and talking about this, they don't want things to change. But it is a fight that must be continued. So, and what happens too is that the right of expression of social activists are actually curtailed in some countries when they try to highlight and raise all these issues. Sometimes even intimidation, prosecution, or even elimination are used to silence whistleblowers and social activists. We can clearly see from the example that I just cited of Eugene Nyambal, who was victimized just because he blew the whistle. However, I mentioned the EITI, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. So this initiative requires companies to declare what they pay to government, and it requires government what they receive from companies. But it is very, very dynamic. And there's something which is very interesting with respect to that. What in fact we call beneficial ownership. Beneficial ownership is actually declaring the true owners of the company. And I think for us as a civil society group, this is one of the tools that we can use to identify all these shady deals, if actually it is properly implemented. In Cameroon, actually, there is already declaration of shareholders in the various companies, but this is not backed by any legislation. It is just that the country is trying to follow, the rules of the EITI, as I just said. And to conclude, because I see our time is almost up, it is very clear that shell companies or anonymous companies in tax havens are used to hide ill-gotten money and avoid taxes by corrupt politicians. And therefore, dismantling the tax haven is a global concern, as Mark rightly said. And it is very important for concerned citizens and also the media, not only in the South, also in the North, to continue to speak out. But there is one paradox. In most countries of the South, despite even the Panama Papers and the release of names of people, you can never see anybody, any high-level politician who resigns from the post because of a scandal like this one. But I've also noticed that in maybe some well-governed countries, because of the Panama Papers, some top-ranking politicians have resigned from their post. So I think instruments like the EITI that I was talking about, they are very, very important. And also the entire transparency agenda that we are trying to push, they are very, very important. So that at least we can fill the civic space and try to push things so that there are some reforms in this sector to make sure that this issue of anonymous companies and shell companies doesn't continue to exist. I know it takes time, I know it is difficult, but we must start from somewhere. And I'm sorry about the connection problems that we had earlier, because I myself, I had a question for Mark, just for some clarification, because that also deepens the work that we are doing. So thank you very much, and again, I'm sorry for the mix-up that we had at the beginning.
Thank you, Jeff, very much for enlightening us on what's happening. I'm glad we got connected because it's really important for us to hear about that and our connections here with some of those same companies that you are dealing with there. Our third presenter is Karen Wilson, and she's going to share some of the work to address corporate transparency through the Publish What You Pay campaign. So I think it's important to see one way that we as partners here have tried to get on that bandwagon. Karen?
Sure. Okay. We've been sort of involved with this since like 2004. The Publish What You campaign was introduced or launched in the United States. We became involved, and what we did was we talked through our Presbyterian Hunger Program, identified various congressmen who were key to this legislation, and then we would contact presbyteries, and throughout those presbyteries then tried to get people to contact their congresspeople to support this. And finally it was included in the Dodd-Frank legislation that Jeff talked about, and in July 2010 this was signed into law. We were celebrating because we thought that was all great, but then it was sent to the Securities and Exchange Commission to be implemented. And meanwhile then the American Petroleum Institute filed a lawsuit against the SEC saying that they could not be competitive if they had to release this information or publish this information, which was sort of a bad reasoning because Canada and European countries also were in the process of implementing the same kind of legislation. And finally, 2010 it was implemented into law. And just in December of 2015, the SEC had a ruling on Section 1504 of Dodd-Frank for calling for a vote in June of 2016. January and February of this year was for public comment and responses to that public comment. And so there's a critical vote to bring this regulation to life this June 2016. So we have our fingers crossed and hopes it will be implemented at that time. So I just sort of briefly went through this because I know we're running late. So that would be my little contribution.
Well, hey, thank you very much. Now we'll open it up for questions. There may be some that have already been submitted to Eileen. If you could read those or unmute, and we have just a few minutes that we can still do for questions.
Pam, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. My question was for Mark, and it's, is there any legislation that's currently pending that would help to shed more light on ownership of corporations?
Yes. There is the Incorporation, Transparency, and Law Enforcement Assistance Act, which the most recent version was introduced by Senators Whitehouse from Rhode Island and Feinstein from California, and also has the support of Senator Grassley from Iowa on the Republican side. Senator Levin was the old sponsor, but he's retired, and he worked with Senator Grassley on this. Grassley has now agreed to sign back on. On the House, a similar version of the bill has been introduced by Representatives Maloney from New York, Manhattan, on the Democratic side, and King on the Republican side, as well as a number of Democratic members who signed on as well. Both bills provide, essentially require the states or the federal government to begin collecting this basic real owner information when companies are first created, and then regularly update it and make it available to law enforcement upon request. The main difference is the Senate bill requires the states to do it, which has pros and cons, and we support that version. We also support the House version, which doesn't require the states to do it, but instead would empower Treasury to require people forming companies to disclose that information to them as a backstop if states do not. So that is the piece of legislation we our coalition and another members of the PWIP coalition, Public Officials Who Pay Coalition, are supportive. And there's a lot of overlap between that and a group called the Financial Accountability and Corporate Transparency Coalition that we're a part of, which includes faith-based organizations, public interest groups, small businesses, and other groups have been advocating for that bill. So now is a great time to reach out to your members of Congress on this issue. We don't necessarily think that it will pass this year, but the Panama Papers provides a great opportunity to, it just makes the issue much more relevant and familiar to offices, and that helps a lot. And I can follow up with more information about some of the offices that are important, but broadly it's members of the Senate Judiciary Committee, like on the Republican side, Senator Hatch from Utah or Senator Graham from South Carolina, and on the Democratic side, Senators Klobuchar and Franken from Minnesota, Senators Durbin and Senator Schumer from Illinois and New York, respectively. And House Financial Services is a committee on the House side. So hope that helps. That's a quick answer to your question.
Thank you. If you could just repeat the name of that bill again, that would be helpful.
Sure, and I'll give you the numbers. It's the Incorporation Transparency and Law Enforcement Assistance Act. The acronym that we don't use because even that's not a good acronym is called ITLI. And the bill numbers are S2489 on the Senate side and HR 4450 on the House side.
4450.
Yep.
Thank you.
Very welcome.
Cliff, you had a question? Cliff, are you there? Well, I can just read his question. He had a follow-up question just to know more specifically who in Congress is opposing changing the Shell Corporation law.
That's a great question, and it's less about folks in Congress and more about interests outside of Congress. So the primary opposition to this bill has been from the states that benefit from the status quo, specifically Delaware, Nevada, and Wyoming, and surprisingly a little bit of Oregon. As I mentioned, all states don't collect this information, but some states benefit from the business of creating companies more than others, and the states I named are the ones who have invested the most in making their states a place where people go to create companies for a variety of reasons, some of them benign and some of them not. Delaware is at the top of that list. And those states working through their own secretaries of state, who are the elected officials responsible for overseeing company registration as well as elections, as everyone knows them in states, have been opposed to this particular piece of legislation for a number of years now. And you know, there are a number of reasons, and we have responses for that. I think it boils down to, they often say they agree that money laundering and corruption is a problem, but think that this solution would be too onerous for them to implement. It could inhibit business activity in their states, and really it's the federal government's problem anyway, because we're really talking about how money enters the financial system, and that's a national problem that deals with banks. And to those things we would say, we all have a part of this: law enforcement, government, banks, lawyers, all the people who are part of this process and taking responsibility. The states need to do it as well. And you know, states can't claim that they are the hub of company formation and then say they don't have a responsibility to provide some basic, very basic transparency. And furthermore, we don't think these measures are onerous. We think there will be some transition time, but to give you an indication of how important the law enforcement community sees this, the Department of Justice and the Treasury have offered $40 million to states to help with a one-time transition cost to essentially update their systems, to change their forms, to change their online systems, and to create the ability to collect this information. So there's a path forward, and we think that you know, it can be done, but unfortunately states that benefit from the status quo are blocking it, and so that's why we need to find other allies, both inside and outside of Congress, to overcome that opposition.
I think we have time for just one last question. So we have a question from Anna. Do you want to ask that, Anna?
Oh, my question is what I wrote. Once the corporation is set up and opens a bank account and money starts going into that bank account, isn't there anyone who is going to notice that there's money coming along and start asking questions about who's paying the taxes on that money?
Sorry, I just unmuted myself. That's a great question. Jeff, I don't know if you have anything to say about it, but I'll start. Yes and no. Banks right now, that's the other big piece of this puzzle, are required to do a certain number of checks to ensure that they are not actively complicit in money laundering. We will set aside for the fact that unfortunately for the last decade or more there have been massive, massive cases that show systemic negligence in the banking sector. HSBC, pretty much every major bank you can think of, global bank, has sooner or later been found out to be taking on billions, if not trillions of dollars from clients that either they should have known who they're doing business with or they did know and just found ways to evade the disclosure requirements. But let's set that aside and just assume the bank is trying to do what's right. Right now there's no requirement for them to secure who the beneficial ownership of that company is. They get some information about the company and the nature of its business, but they're often working with an agent or a lawyer who's representing that business. And since there's no requirements to provide the information and there's no place where they could go to get the information independently, they're kind of out of luck. That's recently changed. The Treasury issued a new rule requiring banks to start doing some of that due diligence, which will be helpful. The rule is rather weak, but at least it means that banks are going to start collecting this. And banks are required to do things like file suspicious activity reports if they see, say, more than $10,000 being withdrawn from a company. But the reality is that without this basic point of origin for the company, even if a bank is interested in finding out who they're really doing business with, and some are, there's a limit to what they're able to do legally and what they're able to do technically. And so that's why this question of beneficial ownership is so important, because it's kind of the root of the issue.
I think that about winds up our time together. I would like to thank again presenters Mark and Jeff and Karen and to everyone participating in this webinar. We hope that this will not only be information for greater understanding, but a resource for connecting us and helping us to discern how we can partner through specific actions to address this issue. A recording of this seminar, including the PowerPoint slides with possible actions, will be available and emailed to you. So please feel free to share it with those you might think would be interested. If you know someone who would like to be included in a future call or would like to know more about the resource extraction and climate issue table, please contact me at lestock@aol.com. Our next call will be Wednesday, July 6th, 3 p.m. EST and 2 p.m. Central, and the focus to be announced. In the meantime, I invite you to follow up on the actions presented by Mark and Jeff and to continue to explore the resources listed in the notices that were sent out and in the recording, if you have not yet had the chance to do that. Until then, goodbye and thank you for joining together around the table today.